Hello, Senior Housing Forum leaders. A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Kim Scott, who published the book Radical Candor, and it was going to be a single article, and so you may have already seen that article. We published the first half of it, but we spent a long time talking about her views on her new book that's coming out about women in power and leadership. And it really seemed more appropriate to publish that interview as a separate article as part of our Women in Senior Living series. And so here's the rest of my interview, and I hope you enjoy it. I think she's got some amazing things to say about how we deal with all kinds of prejudice, but particularly about the challenges that we have with genders in not just senior living, but all industries. So I hope you enjoy the interview. But I want to actually move on because as I was telling you earlier, we've started this new series called Empower on Women in Senior Living. And you're in the process of writing a book about women in business, right? And so can you talk, I don't know much about it. You gave me the title, but talk to me a little bit about that. And you went into this at a time when women still don't have a huge presence in technology, but it was particularly in leadership, but it was much less back then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I started my career 30 years ago now. So, and one of the things, as I was writing Radical Candor and after it came out, one of the things I became increasingly aware of is that issues of diversity and inclusion overall, and specifically to me, issues of gender, are the issues where we most need to solicit and offer radical candor, but where we're the least likely to either speak up or listen. We don't want to hear it, and we don't want to say it. These are these incredibly difficult gender conversations. And so it got me to thinking, why are we least likely to solicit radical candor around gender and to offer it? And why also was I so silent about some problems that I encountered throughout my career? Because I usually I didn't walk the radical candor walk always when it came to issues of gender, to be honest. And so as I started thinking about that, I realized it was the topic of my next book. And what I'm trying to do in the next book, there's another 2x2. So in Radical Candor, it's care personally, challenge directly. And when you're in the upper right-hand quadrant, it's radical candor or compassionate candor. When you're in the bottom right quadrant, where you do challenge, but you fail to show that you care, that's obnoxious aggression. When you're in the bottom left, the worst of all, where you neither care nor challenge, that's manipulative insincerity. And when you care but you don't challenge, I call it ruinous sympathy. So that's the old book. The new book sort of takes apart what happens in the workplace regarding gender and justice. And I think that I like to focus on the path forward as well as the problem. So the path forward is accountability plus respect. And what are the drivers of disrespect in the workplace? Because there's several of them, and even though they're related, I think we need to take them each separately. So there's bias, there's belief, there are sexist beliefs in the workplace that I've encountered and every woman I know has encountered. There's also bullying, sort of a gendered bullying that tends to happen to women. And then once you add bias, belief, and bullying, once you add power into that, then you get discrimination and harassment and actual physical violence. And so it's important to understand that there's a slippery slope from bias to violence. And I would describe there's actually two different slippery slopes from bias to violence. One follows sort of a sexism path from bias to belief to discrimination to violence. And then the other is sort of bias to bullying to harassment to violence. And that's what's typically called misogyny. But I think, and it's important to see this as a whole and to see the slippery slopes, but it's also important when you're in the moment to say, oh, I think I'm experiencing bias, and here's how I respond to bias. I'm just going to hold up a mirror. Or I think what I'm experiencing is a real sexist belief, and I've got to argue with it. So like in the case of bias, early in my career, I had a boss who said to me, I didn't know they let pretty girls be interns here. and I don't think he was trying to be a jerk. I don't think he was trying to be a jerk. I think that was just bias talking. But I decided, I was 18, I was at a bank in Memphis, and I decided in that moment that I was not going to have my career in my hometown. If I was going to be taken seriously, I was going to have to leave and move. And I probably gave that guy too much power over me. But if I had just been able to hold up a mirror and say, what you just said breaks my heart because it makes me think I'll never be taken seriously, I would have given him an opportunity to apologize, and then I might have felt more optimistic about my ability to work there. So that's bias. Now, bullying is very different, and belief are very different, and the responses have to be different. So if somebody has a genuine belief that women are inferior or at least different, should be in a different kind of role, then you've got to do more than just hold up a mirror. So for example, I once was at a meeting in another country with some people who had deeply held religious beliefs about women, and we were drinking tea, and eventually the inevitable happened and I had to go to the bathroom. And this was a problem because there was no women's room in the building because there were no women who worked there. And so this big debate erupts between the men who I was meeting with about where I could go to the bathroom. And some of them seemed to think I could go in the men's room and they would stand outside, and the others didn't think that was okay. And eventually those who didn't think that was okay won out, and they brought me to this dark, stinky mop closet with the bucket. And I just decided, at some point there's a fine line between my respect for your beliefs and my respect for myself. And in this case, it's hot pink and I'm not peeing in the bucket. And so you've got these, but I still didn't quite know what to do in the moment. And luckily I was with this guy who's very supportive, and he said, well, I'll drive back to the hotel with her. She can go, and you men can wait for an hour. I was shocked, but they agreed to wait for an hour while I went to the hotel and came back. So it's so important to realize, like, holding up a mirror would not have been enough in that case. I had to actually take an action. And if I had had more time with them, I would have maybe had an argument. It looks like you had something to say.
No, I was just shocked by the story. That's just amazing.
But this stuff it happens all the time. So now let's talk about bullying. So here's my example of bullying and how to respond. So one time I'm late for a meeting, it's pouring rain, I'm living in New York, I go to hail a cab to get to the meeting, and of course it takes a while, and eventually I get a cab, and I'm just about to open the door, and this man darts out from his doorman building, puts his hand on top of the cab, and he says, "My cab, little lady." And so this is bullying. This is typical bullying. And again, holding up a mirror to him saying, "When you call me little lady, it makes me mad." Like, that would have just been to give him a cookie. That was the whole point, was to make me mad. You can't use your I statements when you're combating bullying. So I used my small stature, and I dove under his arm and slammed the cab door. Cab driver's like busting out laughing, and I got to my meeting on time. So again, you've got to fight bullying with action, and with an action that really creates consequences for the bullying. But with belief, there's no point in punishing belief. No person has ever changed another person's belief by punishing it. Like, that's kind of one of the premises on which our nation is based. And but that doesn't mean that, and you need to respect another person's beliefs, but there's a difference between belief and action. Does that sort of make sense?
It does. And I think one of the things, and I find myself struggling, so never having been female, I don't exactly know. I mean, intellectually, I hear these stories and I understand, but I don't know, obviously, exactly, as you don't know what it's like to be a man exactly. And no. I have discovered, particularly as I've gone through this Empower the Women's series, that I'm learning some things about my biases and beliefs that I didn't know I had. And so I get, one of the things I find myself wondering about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, is that when we have biases and beliefs, oftentimes it takes time for those to move, and there doesn't seem to be, in a whole ton of issues, much tolerance for it taking some time for people to evolve and grow. Do you have any thoughts on that and how you get around that or deal with that?
Yes, I do. As a matter of fact, one of the best pieces of advice I got from anyone around this topic of gender injustice in the workplace was from a young woman who told me that she would have these spaghetti dinners once a month where she would practice responding to whatever crazy thing had been said or done to her that month. And she would invite a bunch of people, men and women, together, and but because the problem is that we don't have a lot of stamina for these conversations. We try to just avoid them. And if we can do something to build stamina for these conversations, then we're going to respond much better next time. And the thing that was powerful about these dinners that she had is that men would also bring in examples of moments when they were treated unfairly, or they felt they had been treated unfairly as men. And the men and the women learned a lot from each other about what it felt to walk in each other's shoes and how they could be upstanders instead of bystanders when the women were suffering from bias or bullying or somebody's belief. Or also when the men were accused instantly of being assholes when that was not their intention. And so this got me to thinking, like, how can we do this? How can we learn to have these conversations where we're all left feeling that we have some agency and grace, that we can even say the wrong thing and be corrected, and that can deepen a relationship instead of rending it apart. And so I've actually been collaborating with Second City Works, the improv group in Chicago. And we're doing these workshops where people come in and they bring a sentence about the moment at work when they were most gobsmacked. And it's not all gender. Sometimes people are gobsmacked by other issues. But we talk about what are the different responses one could have. And people offer up different suggestions. So, for example, in the case of the pretty girl comment, I talked to a bunch of people about what could I have said. I didn't know what to say at the time. I said nothing and just made this big decision that set my life on a particular course. And people came up with all kinds of things. One person said, "Excuse me," what I should have said is, "Excuse me, you seem to be lost. Please get out of my uterus." A man came out. Now, of course, I would never say that,
Right.
but I sort of liked the fact that he suggested it, and it showed that he understood me, and I understood him, and it was sort of funny. Another, my father suggested I should have said, "Eat shit and die," which, of course, I also wouldn't have said, but I could understand that, my father got my rage.
Yeah.
And that was nice. That was nice to see. So, and then it was another man actually who pointed out, if I had just said to the CEO who said the pretty girl comment, "What you just said to me breaks my heart because it makes me feel like I'll never be taken seriously here and I can't build a career in my hometown," he said that would have stopped him in his tracks, probably. And it was so useful to have these conversations and to practice what I could have said. Because you know what? Maybe not that exact thing is going to be said, but I'll be in the situation again.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think I've been really fascinating is I have a woman on my team who's doing some of these interviews, and I've kind of taken this initial position was it's got to be women interviewing women instead of men interviewing women. But I've had a couple of women who've really pushed back and said, "No, Steve, I want you to do it at your platform, your blog." And I'm going to do an interview at the end of this week with a colleague of Adam. Do you know Adam Grant? You're familiar with Giving?
Yes, I love Adam Grant and his work.
Yeah, so he's got a brand new audio book out where he talked a lot about the women in leadership as part of this power thing. And I've got a little bit of a relationship with him. And my first thought was, well, I'm going to get an interview with him. And I thought, well, the optics of Adam and I doing this interview probably aren't great. And so I emailed him and I said, do you have a woman that I could maybe interview or have one of my team member interview? And he immediately came back with somebody who I'm going to interview on Friday, and who's a friend and a work colleague of his. And so we sort of had a pre-discussion this last week about that call. And I said, well, I think I'll probably have one of my team members. And she said, that's part of the problem. When you make it just women and you don't include men in the conversation, it actually makes it worse. And it was kind of like this light went on. And I do think it's a big part of the Me Too. The danger of the Me Too movement is men become so afraid. So I think great advice. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. So
I think it is really important to include everyone. It turns out I really believe in the power of diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And I think the more diverse the conversation can be, the better. And the more we can build stamina to disagree with one another, to challenge one another's thinking, the clearer we collectively will be in our ability to think straight around these issues, which are hard, which are really hard issues. So I think it's really, I'm a big believer in including men in the conversation, to be sure.
So you've sort of,
I think
well, you sort of danced around, let me ask this question and then I'll shut up. But you sort of danced around this a little bit, but I guess the question is when you get into these hard conversations, how do you leave room for people to say potentially offensive and mostly just stupid stuff because they don't know or they don't perceive how it fits without just, creating that kind of a relationship or feeling?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to distinguish between bias, belief, and bullying. Because I think if it's bias talking, holding up a mirror is going to be, you might get a defensive reaction from the person, but just holding up a mirror and giving the person the opportunity to apologize for what they said, to say, that's not what I actually believe, that's not what I meant, I'm sorry about the way that sounded, is the right response, and so important. When it's belief, it's going to take more than that. It's going to take a lot more than that. You've got to decide two things. One is, what action am I going to allow this person's belief to impose upon me, and what am I not? And also, when do I care enough about that person to actually have an argument, to actually debate the belief? And you can't, it's exhausting to debate with someone who you fundamentally disagree with, but it's really important to distinguish between bias talking and an actual hardened belief. And to decide when, there's a time and a place to have a conversation, to actually have the debate. And that's the only way you challenge belief. But when it's bullying talking, when someone is using your gender to bully you, you've got to create consequences. You've got to create consequences. Otherwise, the bullying continues. And that's why I think it's so, you want to leave, you don't want to have zero tolerance, because zero tolerance tends to be the opposite side of the coin of intolerance, right? It becomes intolerant. And so you don't want that, but on the other hand, you don't want to let the bullies off the hook. So that's why it's important to distinguish between what's going on. We need to have the ability to correct a brain hiccup. We need to have the ability to debate a belief. And we need to have the ability to say, you cannot behave that way. Like, that was unacceptable, the way you just behaved. So the guy in the taxi, the people who wanted me to pee in the bucket, and the guy who said pretty girl, 3 very different situations.
Yeah. So in the moment, though, I think the big challenge is in the moment, how do you figure out whether it's bias, belief, or bullying? Because those tend to be very tense moments, right? And
Yeah, in general, I think it's best to respond to something that's said if you don't know, like without assuming. So don't assume good intent, don't assume bad intent. respond to it as though it is bias, as though the person just had a brain hiccup, and then watch how the person responds. And if when you hold up a mirror, the person grins in the mirror and says, yeah, then you're going to have to create consequences. If when you hold up the mirror, the person says, that is what I really believe, then you're going to have to, but you'll get some clues about what's going on with the person based on responding to it as though it's bias. And if it's something that is different from bias, then you're going to have a different response. And by the way, if the person has power over you, the bias and the belief can very quickly become discrimination. And that's where you need some help from the outside if you're the victim of it, because the person has power over you. And if you're worried that you might have, you should be worried in your organization that discrimination and harassment are happening, because they almost certainly are. And I would argue it's your job as the leader to hold yourself accountable, to go look for it. It's not enough to respond to it well when it happens. You've got to go looking for it, because it is happening.
Yeah, and that's the thing you hadn't said before, but I think that that's really critically important, is that you've got to be willing to look for it, and yet you don't want to turn it into a witch hunt either. So
no. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to.
Really tough, right?
Yeah. Well, you don't want it to consume all your time, but believe me, it sort of goes back to the idea of feedback.
Yeah.
If you're not telling somebody something because you don't want to take the time to have the conversation, believe me, it's going to take much longer to fix the longer you wait to solve the problem, the harder it's going to be to fix it. So I would argue you actually save yourself time to go looking for it, because it is discrimination and harassment. They just happen. They happen a lot. I mean, if there's one thing that Me Too has shown us, it's how very common. And it was really interesting. When I started writing this book, I would have said that I hadn't had terrible experiences. Overall, I've been lucky in my career, and I've had probably more than my fair share of success. And yet, when I really started looking at job by job by job, in every single job, some really pretty terrible things happened to me as a woman.
Yeah, I think that awareness is so important. And ultimately, to me, if I'm a great leader, I want to have a place where everybody loves coming to work and doesn't feel threatened or put down. Really, I want to make sure that you, as my employee or part of my team, gets whatever your heart's, within your capabilities, whatever your dream is. My goal is to help that. And if you have that kind of bias or prejudice, you can't do that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, I think you're hitting on another really important point that I'm trying to make in this next book, which is that if you take a look at accountability on a spectrum, accountability to unchecked power, as a leader, you have much more accountability to look for this stuff and prevent it than you do as the victim. And as the bystander, you want to become an upstander. You have more accountability than a victim. And also as what I'm calling, instead of victim perpetrator, I'm calling it confronted confronter. And so if you're confronted, as I have been in my life, at one point, a woman who worked for me accused me of having created a hostile work environment for women. And I was incredibly defensive about it. It was one of the most painful moments of my career. But it was so interesting because when I thought about it, and I didn't think too much about it at the time, I was defensive. But when I thought about it in the course of writing this book, I realized that she was correct. There were several moments in that job where I had responded, instead of responding the way a leader should have responded, I had responded the way a victim might. I had kind of just tried to get around the issue instead of confronting it head on. And so I learned a lot in thinking about it. And so I talk a lot about when you are confronted with having contributed to this, how can you think through what happened and say, yeah, I did make some mistakes. I don't deserve to be pilloried, but I did make some mistakes, and I'd like to I'd like to fix them. And then, of course, your responsibility, I think, is primarily to yourself when you're the confronter, when you're the victim of this stuff. But but especially, like, I feel like I've had some unfair advantages, unfair privileges. I think I am not as sort of a white woman. I am not entitled to respond simply as a victim. I think I have more responsibility because I was born into privilege to try to fix the problem than somebody else who might be struggling more.
Well, and I think that the hardest part that we all have is when we get criticism. It's natural to be defensive, and yet my experience is even when the criticism is unfair, there's often something for me to learn. If only it's what did I do to trigger that violent or strong emotion. And at the end of the day, I mean, as a writer, I get emails regularly telling me what a great job I'm doing, which feel really good, right? But I get those occasional emails. Unusually, I got 2 of them last week that were critical. At least for me, I've gotten to the point where I'm pretty good about saying, I wonder if they're right. And stopping to think about it, because that's where the growth always comes from the critics, not from the people who give accolades. They're almost always true.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think looking at when you get criticism, looking for that, even if you disagree overall with the criticism, looking for that area of agreement where there was something that maybe you did that wasn't perfect, which we all do. And I think also the other thing you can do when you get especially heated criticism is you can really build a relationship with that person by addressing the emotion, because they're heated for a reason, and it may not be entirely your fault, but you may have contributed to it. And so by trying to understand why the person is as upset as they are at what you did, you can learn a lot.
Yeah. Well, so when's the book coming out? I can hardly wait to read it already.
Yeah, well, you and me both. I'm right in the middle. I think I've deleted about 400 pages, and I have about 100 pages written. I hope it'll come out in March of 2020.
Terrific. Well, I'm looking forward to it. I just can't tell you how much I appreciate your spending this time with me. By doing this, you're making a real contribution to our industry. And this is all about learning and growing together. So again, I appreciate it a ton.
Well, thank you. Your industry is playing a vital role in our world, and I appreciate the work you all do.